Salutations, respected viewers. This is George from Ireland. I'm continuing my series on the history of Germany, 1918 to 45. For A-level, I'm concentrating now on the Holocaust, or what's sometimes called the final solution. That's what the Nazis called it. The Shoah, Jewish people tend to call it. So where does the word come from? Bizarrely, in the Old Testament, you'll find this word. Well, it's like a Greek translation from it. It's like a burnt offering to the Lord, a pleasing odor when people slaughtered sheep or doves or whatever it was and burnt them. But anyway, why did the Nazis decide to murder Jewish people, and when did they decide it? These are contentious issues. There are two major schools of thought. These are functionalists and intentionalists. The functionalists say that the Nazis made it up as they went along because the Nazis were so disorderly and it was more or less on the spur of the moment. Whereas intentionalists say, no, the Nazis had a crystal clear plan. They always wished to do this, and they just came into the open about it relatively late on. So anti-Semitism was certainly at the core of Nazi ideology, and the leading Nazis, such as Hitler or Julius Streicher or Himmler, had been anti-Semites even before they joined the party. Hitler's book is entitled Mein Kampf, and Jewish people are mentioned on 60% of its pages, and these are never complimentary or even neutral mentions. But Hitler didn't actually call for them to be killed in the book, nor did he say they ought to be all expelled from Germany. He wanted them to be discriminated against, and he laid the blame at their door for really everything that had gone wrong in Germany for centuries. It couldn't possibly be that Germans were responsible for anything bad that happened. Well, he said a few socialists and or traitors and liberal sort of people, they were partly responsible because they were in cahoots with the Jewish community. It's complete bunkum, but anyway, that's what the Nazis believed. In May 1939, Hitler gave a speech saying that if the Jews cause another war in Europe, this will lead to the complete rooting out of the Jewish community. Although that German word for rooting out, it could also be translated as destruction. So was that him announcing that he planned to kill the Jewish community? It's arguable. Anyway, so did Hitler always plan to murder the Jews? Well, consider his actions. Bear in mind that by the time the war broke out, the majority of the Jewish community had left the country already. However, the Nazis then caught up with them. Let's say Anne Frank's family, which had left Germany and moved to the Netherlands, precisely because of Nazi bigotry, but then the Netherlands was annexed by Germany, so they were caught. So letting them leave the country wouldn't necessarily mean there was a plan to really let them go if the Third Reich was intending to catch up with them. But again, the Netherlands was conquered really for military reasons, not because there was a plan to let's get the Jewish people and kill them so they can't escape. So a lot of decisions to murder Jewish people were taken on an ad hoc basis. Commanders on the Eastern Front saying, well, we're just going to murder Jewish civilians, particularly in the Soviet Union. So Hitler found out this and approved of it post factum. But later on it was organised on a grand scale. Anyway, the key meeting of the Holocaust was the Wannsee Conference in January 1942. Wannsee is a lake just outside Berlin, and there's a very handsome villa there, and these astonishingly tranquil surroundings. A group of about 24 leading Nazis met and decided, what are we going to do? Well, we're going to kill all the Jewish people, and in the space of about 2 hours, this plan was hatched to wipe out the Jewish community in Europe. You can see a film about it called Conspiracy. It's a fabulous film, and it takes place in real time, as in the meeting took roughly 2 hours, and so does the film. Minutes survived of the meeting. No, it's not verbatim, but it's the broad outline, and the script writers had to use a bit of imagination to fill in the gaps. The Third Reich was chaotic in some ways, but they did have a broad brush plan for the annihilation of the Jewish community. So many Nazi luminaries were there. Hitler was not present, but he was informed about it later on. But even the Wannsee Conference used euphemisms, said evacuation. Obviously they meant killing people though. So the strictest secrecy was preserved, and all records of the meeting were supposed to have been destroyed, but one of them survived the war. And this is how Holocaust deniers get going. They point out, but it only says evacuation in the in this minute of the Wannsee Conference, but there are other documents where it does actually say that evacuation is to be a code word for killing. There were previously considered plans such as expelling the Jewish community and moving the Jewish people to Palestine, because Zionism had got going, or indeed Madagascar. But these goals were unobtainable because of the war. So the Nazis, they were not logical, they didn't think things through, even in their own evil way, that coming up with a certain objective, spelling it out clearly, and then planning steps to give oneself the best chance of accomplishing a goal. The Wannsee Conference is one of the few exceptions to that, but again, it's relatively late on. The Nazi government had been in power for about 9 years by that time. If it was such a high priority, wouldn't they have started much sooner? So the aim of the final solution, which is the murder of all Jewish people in Europe, was supposed to be realized quite quickly. People were sent to concentration camps where they were worked very hard indeed, given starvation rations, no medical care, and of course there was severe brutality against them. So yes, large numbers of people in concentration camps died, but they were seldom directly killed. Usually they were indirectly killed from a combination of malnutrition, a lack of sanitation, the absence of even the most basic medical care, exhaustion, exposure, and so forth. Whereas in extermination camps, people arrived, and within a few hours, most of them had been killed. People who were healthy in their late teens or 20s and so on, they were sent to concentration camps, where again, huge numbers of them died, but usually after a few months. Whereas little children, elderly people, mothers of small children, were often sent to extermination camps and usually murdered within hours. There's this distinction between the two, concentration camps and extermination camps. So the Nazis estimated that they would wipe out the Jewish community by the end of 1945. Those people who were unfortunate enough to fall into their hands, they could have kept children if they wanted to simply treat the Jewish community as slaves, because these people were not very economically productive when they're little, but after a few years they'll be grown up and will be economically productive. But no, the Nazis wanted to wipe out this ethno-religious group. So some people are slipshod and they don't grasp the distinction between extermination camp and concentration camp. And again, this is what allows Holocaust deniers an opportunity, when they'll say, you said there was a gas chamber at a concentration camp. There were none. And strictly speaking, of course, they were right, because the gas chambers were usually at extermination camps. There might be crematoria at a concentration camp, because again, large numbers of people died, and that was a way of disposing the bodies. People were rarely buried. Although huge pits were dug where hundreds or even thousands of people were shot dead, and sometimes they were buried, particularly in the Soviet Union. So this was yet another one of the barbarous crimes that the Third Reich committed on an absolutely enormous scale. And many of the Jewish people murdered were Soviet citizens. Almost half of them were Polish, and they came from various other European countries such as France, Germany, and so forth. So a few Jewish people would be chosen as Sonderkommando, and they had to gather the clothes of those being murdered or help operate the gas chambers. And if they failed to cooperate, they'd be murdered themselves. But they were vital eyewitnesses in some of the trials after the war. One can't judge these people for seeking to survive. And these people may have rationalized it to themselves. If I don't volunteer to do it, someone else will do it. It does nothing for my people and my cause for me to get killed right now. They were doing it to save their lives. So if I were in that situation, surely I would have done the same. Anyway, the Wannsee Conference envisaged killing the Jewish community in about 3 years. But there were other groups who were also murdered in the Holocaust in huge numbers. Gays, gypsies, physically and mentally disabled because the Action T4 was reactivated, Quakers, Jehovah's Witnesses, Freemasons, at least 80,000 Freemasons murdered, pacifists, lesbians, alcoholics, misfits, petty criminals. Soviet prisoners of war were also abominably treated, and many of them murdered too. And resistance fighters from other countries, all sorts of civilians. Anyway, people were taken as slave laborers from all occupied countries. That's not, strictly speaking, part of the Holocaust, but often put to work in absolutely horrendous conditions and fed very meager rations, subjected to brutality such as whipping and so on. So don't let anyone tell you that the Nazi regime was good or even morally neutral. Certainly it was foul. So one of the most controversial issues surrounding this harrowing topic is how much the German public knew about it. And the official line is that secrecy must be preserved, but the Nazis were proud of their work. But they also created a pornography of death, taking photos and films of this and trying to record it a bit. That's why about 4.7 million names of Jewish victims have been preserved. Some people are anonymous. In the case of the Gypsy community, they're not a very organised and literate community, so there are fewer records of that, and that's why it's difficult to get an estimate of the numbers of Gypsies who were murdered. Sometimes people of other nationalities volunteered to participate in the Holocaust. So Daniel Jonah Goldhagen's book came out in 1998, Hitler's Willing Executioners, and he argues that the majority of Germans were well aware of what was going on and were either indifferent or indeed approved, and very few actually disapproved, even privately. In the Cold War, this made life uncomfortable when people were seeking reconciliation with Germany, and therefore some Western governments created the myth that most German people were unaware of what was going on. So it's estimated 6 million Jewish people were murdered in the Holocaust.